Thank you all for coming. Thank you for asking me for this plenary. And thank you for hopefully be a little patient with the title of this presentation, because I realized when I was preparing that the presentation keep changing all the time. So maybe the title doesn't completely fit. It is about stories, but whether it's about the importance of telling stories, I'm not quite sure. But I would like to go on. First, I want to present myself and tell a little bit of my story, and I have a reason for that I will come back to. My name is Anette Sogaard Nielsen. I'm from Denmark, and I'm so happy to see old friends here. I've been member of MINT since '97 and participated in most forums. So there are people among you that I know, and even some I know very well, and there's a lot of people I've never seen before, or if I've seen them, I apologize because I can't remember. I was for many years the only one in Denmark who was a MINT trainer, I think for, I don't know, 6, 7 years. We're a small country, like I mentioned yesterday, we mentioned yesterday. And then now we are a big group of Danish MINTs, and that is lovely. Yeah. Sorry. My own story is that I've been working in the addictions since '92. I mean, that's the only thing I know about. That's treatment of alcohol problems. I hardly know anything else. And that is, for those of you who participated in the workshop with Tom Bart and Karen Nielsen, this is how we are in Scandinavia. We find it very difficult to, to say that we know more than we are absolutely sure we know, really, and that is difficult. But for me, it is true. The only thing that I really know something about is treatment of alcohol problems. And I'm going to talk a bit about that today, but not treatment per se, but more about what happens in treatment. I am not a clinician. I am a researcher, although I for many years were head of one of the largest treatment institutions in Denmark. I was all the time also a researcher. That is what I tend to believe the reason why I was accepted in the area was because I knew about what the research said. I performed research, I engaged clinicians in research, and they loved that because we had a really nice collaboration about them telling me about, their challenges, or telling us, because I was definitely not me, we were a team, and we could try to provide the insight, the knowledge that they requested, and then that raised new questions, and we kept on back and forth and back and forth. My background is actually in literature, and there's a reason why I mentioned that. I studied literature at university when I was very young, didn't do it for many years afterwards. I'm also a very mathematical person, so the research I perform is mostly with hardcore data, epidemiology, and numbers. And that may sound a little bit schizophrenic. To me, it's not. It makes sense because depending on the question you ask, you have to use different methods. And lately, I've had the privilege to be engaged in what we call what's named at our university, my university where I work, narrative medicine, where you actually combine working with literature and you combine research in healthcare, and you work with medical students and you actually read literature together with them, and you talk about how does that help you to understand stories, how does that help you to understand your patients, and what can literature offer you, because literature is wonderful, because that's a possibility to get into people's head. I mean, think about it. When you read a story, you get into another person's head and you see it from their eyes. And whenever can we do that elsewhere? So that is great fun. And to me, it fits perfectly with motivational interviewing. So this is what I'm doing in narrative medicine. These are sneaking exercises for motivational interviewing, when we try to help these medical doctors to translate from literature into how does that function with your patients? Well, that was a bit of a story. Now I'm going to move on to what I'm actually going to talk about, because I'm going to talk about a study that's not published yet. We hope to submit it in a month or so, that I'm performing together with a colleague who comes from literature, from the humanities purely. But I'll come back to that. I hope you'll find it interesting. I need to have, I've said that to a few of you, that I need to just have a disclaimer. It's not like the one Bill made yesterday saying this is the first time I talk about this. This is the first time I talk about this. I mean, Bill's very confident when he says that, and we know all that is going to be wonderful. I know that there are two things that are risky here. One is, I know that my PowerPoint presentations, at least at times, is extremely boring. Now I'm saying that up front because I'm going to show you transcripts of sessions, and that is boring, difficult to read. I have to read it aloud. It's going to be pretty slow. So now you're prepared. That's one thing. The other thing is, half of the time, I catch myself thinking, this is not at all new. I mean, everybody knows this beforehand. So they'll just say, what? And so what? And half of the other half of the time, I think I'm going to get kicked out of Mint because I'm going to say that sorry, Bill, there are places in the new book where I don't think it's true. So now you're warned. Now you're warned. It can go in every kind of direction. Mm-hmm. Yes. So I'm going to talk about what we know about how MI works. And that has been studied. A lot of the kind of studies that I, in a way, tend to be used to because it's about numbers. Quantitative, the linguistic analysis of clients' utterances and how it relates to outcome. We all know about that. We have learned about it. We have heard about it in trainings. Amheim studies, the more studies, very much about the importance of, it's quite amazing, right? I don't know what's happening. It's like being in the middle of I don't know, a racket, no, I don't know. No, I'll try to forget about that. But we know that. We know of the importance of change talk and, less and less sustained talk and how that relates to outcome. We also have learned about, therapy skills and what the therapist says, how it relates to engagement and how it relates to outcome. There have been a series of studies of that where we use the different versions of Mighty to code what the therapist is saying, and then we measure it and we see how it's going. And I'm so glad to see Lottie is here because you did one of these studies and it's highly interesting. There are also other kinds of studies. I'm so glad to see that Claire Lane is here because you were one of them, one of those who made a discourse analysis about the conversations about alcohol and based on motivation interviewing and how clients negotiate, how you position alcohol and how you interpret what's about to be changed. And of course, Bill mentioned yesterday, there's a study of Summers and Carr and her anthropological studies about how not only about the sect that we are part of, but also about what's going on in MI trainings and what's going on in MI sessions, and where she specifically focused on the pauses in the conversation. That's something and she was amazed about how we all talk the same way. And that's quite interesting to hear from that point of view. And then there are more traditional qualitative studies where you interview patients about how they experience MI and what's going on and what do they think or feel that makes a difference. And they have begun to come. There hasn't been a strong tradition for these studies, but they have begun to come, and even some that doesn't necessarily focus on only the positive aspects of MI. And I'm not going to say that much about that, but that's quite interesting. And just to walk through a few of these, there's a study by Sarah Jones and colleagues about how clients experiences, and I just pulled out some of the quotes about what clients says about how MI works. And here's a quote with a patient saying, she's driving the conversation very, very subtle. That's the trick. If you listen to her carefully, it's just little keywords, little keynotes. She's allowing me to take the reins of the conversation, but she's steering it very gently. I think that's what we all hope for when we have an MI conversation. This is a really, really nice client. And another client, quotation, she does, I don't know, she makes us think about stuff I didn't even know I was thinking. Isn't that lovely? Or yet another one. So, and because we work together, and that's the only way to describe it, working together, because it's teamwork. She's supporting me and I'm working through this. Oh, we're almost weeping. And this one, actually, it's the same one. I came away with a renewed sense of purpose. It's like re-shining your armor. Give it a new coat of polish. Oh. Then there's another story from another study. I had the feeling that I still owned the question and that she, the therapist, was there as a resource to me. A little later, when I asked for advice, I got it. And otherwise, she mainly encouraged me to think by myself and to ask myself, what can I do to improve my situation? It becomes more and more beautiful. And this from a third study. As I said, just try to boost my confidence, trying to affirm that what I was doing was right. She thought that I was a determined person. She said, oh, you hadn't tried that before. Oh, good on you. Well done. So affirmation, I suppose, is the best word for it. I mean, this is really... So I think we all agree, and I think not just within the sects, but outside the sects, that we agree that MI works. And that is even, and now I'm taking it from the new book, and I don't disagree here. MI works. It's better than doing nothing. It's not always not a help. There are situations where it's not, where it's something else that's needed. Treatment fidelity matters, so what the therapist does matters. Provider skills are related to positive outcome, particularly the fewer MI inconsistent responses is of importance. We don't want people trying to persuade or confront and all that. And more MI consistent responses matters. We also know that high level of MI spirit matters, focus matters. But now I would like to dive a little bit more into why it is that it seems to work. And now comes the risky bit. So now you have to be a little patient with me. I'll just not going to spend much time on that, but I am going to talk about stories, not stories, traditional stories with a start and an end, and not life stories, but another kind of stories or bits of stories. Stories are important to humans. I think we all know that. If you begin to recognize it, you will realize we tell stories all the time. It's actually pretty rare that we only offer very, what you call concrete or very specific information very often. When we answer stuff, we answer with bits of stories as examples to make a point, to just explain what we're thinking at. Then we begin to tell stories. We tell stories on all levels. Some would even argue that's what the huge difference is between us and animals, the ability to tell stories. It's a way of making sense of what's happening with us and in the world, and in particular of our own experiences, and in particular in relation to time and of change. So we talk about when something, how it starts, how it changes, how it develops, how it ends. And there's a huge bunch of literature arguing that the stories we tell about our lives is what actually constitutes our identity. It's not enough just to talk about you have a personality disorder, or whether you don't understand people. You don't understand people. They don't understand themselves just by saying that I'm a woman, I'm 63, I live in the middle of the country. But I have stories about myself, and that's what constitutes that the feeling of who I am. I am a mother, I relate, I really I mean, honesty is important to me. I need to, you know, well, that's another Danish expression that is weird, by the way, compared to yesterday. In Danish, you would say that he's a man for his hat. Doesn't make sense. It just means that you stand for what you stand for. I mean, you have to, you know, to bring it forward. You can't just hide it and behave like that's stories about me. They constitute my identity more than that I'm gray-haired, 63, and have 2 kids in a way. And these identities tend to draw on master stories. And master stories in this respect are the large stories in society or in subcultures. For example, the Bible offers a very strong master story. Freud even offers a master story that there's something in us that are unconscious, and that's what we refer to every now and then. So we refer to master stories. We refer to master stories about Cinderella, for example. We know all when we talk about, oh, that's more or less, that made me feel like Cinderella. So everybody knows, at least in Denmark, what that means. In Denmark, you have a famous author and from the 1600 and something that wrote plays, and he for example wrote a play about a man who was drinking, and he was drinking because his wife was hitting him all the time. He was after him, so he was really, you know, had a very aggressive wife, and this guy was drinking. And there's an expression in that play that Jeppe says, don't ask why Jeppe is drinking. Well, ask why is Jeppe drinking. Don't just say that he is drinking. Why is he drinking? And everybody in Denmark would know that that means that there's a reason why you're drinking. It's not just because bad habit. It's just because you became addicted because it was a lot. That can actually happen. I mean, a lot of people drink and get addicted, but just because they didn't really recognize that they were drinking a lot, and all by a sudden it took them by surprise they were addicted. But then a Danish idiom is to say, ask why is Jeppe drinking? And everybody knows that, even people who have never seen the play or haven't even read it. So these master stories are bits and pieces that we draw upon when we describe our identity. Now I come to this study that I'm currently working on together with a colleague, Cindy Sogaard, who is a wonderful person and very skilled into analyzing narratives in literature and in interviews and all kinds of material. And what we are looking at is motivational interviewing as a means to identify creation and co-creation. So this is an analysis of what we call small stories in first encounters between clients suffering from alcohol use disorders and their therapists. So we simply want to study what's going on in these first encounters. So we have, and we want to see how both the client and the therapist impact one another, and how they share, and who's steering, how do people position. So it's a little bit like a discourse analysis, but not quite. And I'll come back to that. The material we have is a bunch of studies, and Lotte who sits there will know that. We at the research unit where I work, we participated in a large study where we randomized plus 60-year-old patients seeking treatment for alcohol use disorders, and we randomized them into either a relatively very short intervention consisting of motivational enhancement therapy, 4 sessions, or the same 4 sessions, and in addition to that, up to 8 sessions of community reinforcement approach adjusted for seniors. So it was, in a way, a randomized control trial where we randomized these plus 60-year-old people suffering from alcohol dependence who sought treatment, and we randomized them between a short treatment and a longer treatment. And both treatments had entirely motivational interviewing as the first sessions, and it was the underlying for the first 4 sessions, but as you may know, motivational enhancement therapy is a little bit more than motivational interviewing. It's also about giving feedback and so on. But the first session was entirely motivational interviewing. And then if you had drawn the long treatment, you would have some more cognitive behavioral therapy in the end. So what Cindy and I did was we took all, draw randomly from the first encounters these patients had, because that was purely motivational interviewing. And we had these interviews transcribed. And I was curious about it, because this is also, for me, a study, at least that was what I was hoping for in the beginning. Perhaps it's a little less that in the end, but I was, it's also about presenting, a client presenting him or herself to a person he or she has never met before. And this person is using motivational interviewing. So for me, it was also very much about how do you actually talk about your problem in that situation? And of course, very much about how does the therapist elicit it. So that's a bit about the material that we have. And I'm going to this is a bit about how we analyze these interviews, because Cindy introduced me to a method of analyzing that's from a guy called Michael Bamberg. He has developed it. And what he focuses on, or what this method, analytic approach focuses on, is all the bits and snippets and what people are saying. And he's taking all these bits and snippets and small stories, and he analyzes them in layers. So the first level is trying to understand what is actually going on here. What are they telling? Purely, trying to understand what are they saying, not interpreting it more deeply, but trying to understand what's going on. So it's about what is told here. The next level is about how are these two persons positioned in relation to one another. And obviously there's a high level of a help, a patient seeking help and somebody offering. So there's a kind of positioning that's really relatively obvious, but it's also about seeing how does this position change, or do they change throughout the stories, and then how does the narrator, the person who talks, how are they positioning themselves in relation to the rest of the context, the world, which, for example, is drawing upon master stories. So this is now that comes the slightly boring part, because now we are going to walk through these levels in a couple of examples. So what Bamberg is suggesting, or is focused on, is the positioning, how we see people move around throughout when they work through all these stories and all these 3 levels, and obviously all 3 levels interact to one another, so they are never straightly divided. So I'll take the first example. It's a woman. Oh, and I can't see my notes. I just realized now. Oh, Jesus Christ. Now I'll try to remember what's in my notes. Yeah, because this is the first time I talk about it. So for once, I really had note. I normally don't have that, but I had. Well, the good thing is that I'm not going to read up from my notes. I mean, so you can be happy for that. Well, Olive, Olive is, I mean, obviously she's above 60, because that was the inclusion criteria in the study. So she's a mature woman that seeks treatment, and that's the first time. She has a daughter. She's working still. She's not retired yet. Nobody at her workplace really know about this problem that she has. That actually very few of people around her knows about the problem she has. But her daughter is concerned, and her daughter has noticed that her mother was drinking, and the daughter has tried to talk with her about it, and that's really, I mean, she's shameful about this, Olive, and she doesn't like it, and she's not quite sure what to do. So you could say she's a classic example of a person who shows up and where perhaps MI makes sense. So I'm going to walk you through very early, relatively early in this first encounter with this study, with this therapist. And the only thing that has been before that is that she's informed about what's going on, because this is a research study. So she's informed about, the structure. You have drawn this, that means we have that and that many, available, and this is how it works here. And you can choose, what time of day you want to come, and blah, 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 blah. So there's some formal information that has been handed over. And that's where the therapist then say, okay, what are you thinking right now? And Olive says, well, then let me give this a try. And the therapist obviously hear that she's a little bit reluctant. So she says, oh, yes, you're both kind of a little for it, a little against it. Yes, Olive says. Yeah. And the therapist mirrors her. Yes, I am. What's the worst that can happen if you participate and get this form of treatment? What would be the worst about it? It's just primarily if I don't get anything out of it myself. I mean, if it's only research. Yeah. And what would be the best? That I can take something from here home with me? Therapist, yes. And get some tools, right? That's just it. That's what I would like to have. Yeah, so you're a little nervous that maybe it's a bit of a waste of time. And at the same time, you're thinking, maybe it's worth giving it a chance. Yes. Shall we take the leap? Olive, yes, let's do it. That's good. And you are, of course, as I said earlier, you can say at any point, this isn't for me after all. Yes, and good, super that you simply say it from the beginning, Olive. I think so, just so we have things straight. And in a way, that's pretty classic. And if you think about it through these lenses of Bamberg, you see here's a woman and she's, reluctant and doesn't really know. And she talks a little bit about, a problem. And you see the therapist where she's defensive. You see she's seeking help, but not quite sure that this is the place to get it. And there's a helper. And you see how the therapist negotiate. And she does that by, of course, affirming and strengthening autonomy. Says you can decide to leave. And then she levels the positions by saying, should we take the lead? It's not you take the lead, it's we take the lead. So the therapist at least changes his or her position and moves around the table, so to speak, to sit alongside Olive here. And if you take it to the third level, you can see that Olive, in a way, is drawing a little bit on this ambivalence, obviously classic master story about being ambivalent, whether to join or not. And the therapist is actually changing that into a story. You're a strong person. You really want to know if you get something out of it. You're not taking anything for granted. I mean, good for you. You don't engage in something if there's nothing into you. So she's in a way negotiating into another, drawing a bit upon another master narrative. Does that make sense for you? Yes. Good. Because, that's what I hope that's what's in my notes. I'll check afterwards. So on level 1, the story is about a woman who keeps her drinking to herself and is ambivalent. And this changes on level 2. The position changes from a little bit, at least, into people who are collaborating. And, on level 3, it changes a little bit from these cultural stereotypes in this study. So if you continue, so a little bit later now, Olive has talked about how her drinking is and what she has experienced. And she talks about, how, well, it was too much and her daughter saw that and blah, blah, blah. So then Olive says, but from there, from all that drinking and to reach that 100% realization, right, where you say, now this has got to end, that takes time, doesn't it? Because you find 117 excuses, So the therapist says, there's a thing that's called a circle of change. And I don't know if you're familiar with that. Some clever people have drawn it. I just try to draw it from you up here. We do like this. It looks a little funny. Up here is what's called the pre-contemplation stage. That's where you haven't really even given it a thought to the fact that this is a problem? Yes, yes, always. And one hasn't even given it a thought. And then it dawns on one, and then it's called contemplation or ambivalence. And that's right here. I can recognize that. Yeah, it's right here where you're placed on the one side. So one really wants to good things for one's daughter right here at the other side. It's also nice to be able to have a glass of alcohol once in a while, isn't it? Yeah, yeah. But at the same time, there is, a sweet daughter here who I really would like to be a good mother for. Yes. And it's tough sometimes when the alcohol occupies your thoughts. That teetering back and forth. Yeah, yeah, exactly. Perfectly normal to feel that way. Yes. And that's how it is with everything one has to change. Yes. So one's ambivalent at one point, right? Yes. And on the other hand, that's yes. And then one takes a decision. Yes. And now something has to happen. This has to look different. I want to do something about it. And then one takes action. Yes. Take action. Take action on a decision. You did that, you took a decision. Now something different needs to happen. So you've come here. Yes. And a little later, I'm never going to drink so much again. I just know that. Oh no, that's actually probably others who have said the same thing, but you have firmly decided that things must be different. And that's, one can say, it can take me a very long time to come or to go from here. So when I first get here, I'm very determined. And I'm so stubborn that, that's just the way it's going to be. So you bring really good qualities with you into this battle of alcohol. Yes. Beautiful session, isn't it? So again, you can see this is really a woman moving from, if you remember when she came, she was really reluctant about going seeking treatment at all. And she was actually pushed by her daughter in, over the doorstep. And now this is really changing. So on the face value of this conversation is that it's a story about it takes time to reach a decision and about feeling pressure. And it's also a story about how this is changed into a story about normality. And this is what the therapist obviously does by introducing this stages of change model and talk about it in third person. One has to, one can get engaged in one's daughter. But it's also obvious that it's the therapist that becomes the primary narrator of Olive's story here. It's not that she's not aligned with Olive, because Olive acknowledges all the time, yes, yes, that's it, yes, yes, I recognize. But it is definitely the therapist who is narrating the story. And that also, again, means that you draw upon different master narratives. A very normal, traditional story about ambivalence. You have to go back and forth. It takes tons of times, 117 excuses, to almost a story about a female heroine who takes action, takes care of her daughter, and really moves forward. It's really, really, that's the new story. Your firm decision, good you came, it's really, it's going to be wonderful. So you changed the story. Yeah. That was the example with Olive. Now I'm moving on to Nicholas, which is a little bit different to something, but actually quite different. And Nicholas is retired. He has been, what do you call that, a blue-collar workman for all his life. I worked in a factory, and they were drinking quite a lot there. He lives on his own. When he got retired, that was hard on him. Because he had this social community he was part of at work, and there was guys there he was drinking with, not necessarily that much, but he loved the social part, and he loved, to go drinking. He enjoyed that. And now, sorry, now it became more difficult after he got retired. He has adult children that are concerned about him. He has friends that are concerned about him. And he has tried treatment before. This is not the first time for Nicholas. He has been in treatment several times. And when he sought treatment this time, the therapist that he normally sees at the alcohol treatment center said to him, we have a study going on at the moment for people above 60. So maybe you would be interested in that. That would mean that you have to be assessed, and we collect data, and then there's specific structure. But if you're interested, I mean, I can refer you to this, to this person who can enroll you in the study. And he said, yes, I'm perfectly willing to do that. So the therapist he sees now is new to him. He has not seen her before. So that's where we start. And Nicholas is, of course, describing himself because this therapist don't know him. So he describes his background to her and said, oh, and that comes the story about, oh, well, I suddenly had a lot of time. He's being a pensioner, you know, and well, you just sit around there bored. And the therapist says, oh, so something happened in your circumstances, something that changed, you got more time on your hands. There was suddenly no longer work that called on you every day, and that meant that alcohol could take up more room in your life again. And he continues to tell a bit about how that increased. And he says, in the end, that's a short version. That's a short version. Yes, Nicholas said. Yes, the therapist says. And the reason why I'm showing that is because that really shows how they mirror one another. I mean, Nicholas also mirror her. I mean, really showing that we are in good contact here. So the therapist said, well, I'm thinking, you know, that about the period you're telling about here, where you suddenly go from being part of the workforce and then all the way to today. Yes, Nicholas said, and where you think now something else needs to happen. Now you will take part in this project, the study here, and look at yourself in a different way. And then Nicholas describes how that was natural to him. He has been part of a couple of other research studies about blood pressure and other kinds of stuff. And the therapist, okay, so you're the kind of person who actually is the kind who's very keen on benefiting science, if you like, from the experiences you've had. Yes, Nicholas, like that. And there you're actually thinking that alcohol, it was also something where you could be open about and also examine a bit more closely where you yourself stand. Yes, Nicholas said. And here, if you take it in bits here, obviously this is a story about boredom and about following advices. If you just look at it a little bit, I mean, Nicholas is actually quite passive here. He's invited to do stuff and he does that. He's passive, and he doesn't actually even himself say that he's so engaged in research. It's actually the therapist who puts thoughts into his head. You think that this is you think that this is what you want to do. So it's about Nick on the first level. It is about a story about being bored, and then about drinking when being bored, and it's about following advices. For the therapist, introduces another story about inner processes that Nicholas actually hasn't told about. On the second level, it's obviously an encounter between the therapist and the client in need of help. Nicholas doesn't change that at all. It doesn't change throughout, at least not so far. It's also a story about a rather cultural stereotype of a workman that are relatively classical. And the therapist offers another counter-narrative entailing more agency. You'd think about that, you want to do, you decide, you want to give back to society. And if you continue, then Nicholas describes how he's drinking, has been drinking. And then the therapist says, oh, yeah. And there your body simply gives you a sign that now it's enough after that. And then you go on and do something different again. And Nicholas says, I don't know, I just choose to say that I get some moral hangovers. Because I feel I let other people down. You feel that you can't be the person that you want to be in your life. Yes, I feel that I let some people down. And there you're thinking that it's important to you to deal with or change these things again? Yes. And that you can be the person that you want to be again? Yes. Yeah. It sounds as if you actually reach inside and find the resources to make a change from something that is back to something you really want to have in your life. That's freedom for you, yourself, to be the person that you want to be. I don't know. I don't know if it should be expressed in that way, because I really love snaps. That's an acronym. I really love it. I like the taste. And then after 3 or 4 mornings when I've been drinking, then I feel now I have to taste it. And then it's just after these 2 to 3 days, then the moral hangovers come. Yes. So on one hand, you like the taste of schnapps, and that's something, that's it. That's when you have abstained for a while. Then there's something that can come and remind you how good it has been, that taste of schnapps and such, yes. And on the other hand, then you say that then it goes fast, and where it's the negative things begins to start to add up, and where you can feel that this is very bad for yourself. So you have to just take a look at yourself again, yes, and try something else. Yeah, that's what I said. It's the moral hangovers that comes. It's the moral hangover. Yes, yes, yes. So there's short periods where you actually use alcohol in. Yes, yes, because that's when I've had those 2 to 3, 4 days. Then I call the other therapist at the treatment center. Yeah. And then I say to her, I'm up into my neck in shit. I'm coming. Yes, that's also something about you having found a strategy. This saying to yourself, now I need something else has to happen. And it's simply by coming here, by coming to this alcohol unit and just get the fire put out in that way. And then get on with what you really want to do. Yeah, that's both right and wrong, what you're saying. Yeah, because when I've had them every other 3, 4, 4th month, then I really miss the snaps like hell. I do. I have to admit it. So this is another story. And on the face value, I mean, it is a story about really liking the taste of snaps and really liking everything about it. So it's snaps, as pointed out, as being more or less the solely reason of relapse. And also the story about how Niklas trusts that after a couple of days we have been drinking excessively, and he gets what he calls the moral hangovers, then he knows, I have a phone call, I call a therapist. Obviously not to have a permanent change, but to stop this drinking this time. So he foregrounds his risk, his love of taste, love of snaps. And the therapist, as we can see, really tries to background it and really tries to focus and lift and throw light on the periods of abstinence and how Niklas wants to change and become sober and be the one person he wants to be. So we can see that here, the Niklas and the therapist, in a way, negotiate. It's not necessarily, I mean, at this time he's actually sober because now he hasn't showed up. So this time it's hard to say that he's actually taking the position of one being what wants to go for help. But they are negotiating how to interpret his story. And Niklas really hangs on to his own story. I don't know, I choose to call it, I mean, so he asserts his authority of his own story. And the therapist, of course, don't want to break the relation with Niklas. And you can see that with all the language synchronicity, they keep using each other's words all the time. So they're really, I mean, they're very good relation here, although they are negotiating. And we can see it's a pretty complex stories. When Cindy and I discussed it, I thought this is more like Niklas is drawing on the master story about redemption. I mean, I'm drinking too much now. It's just like more or less going to church. And I'd say to the priest, I would just want, to, what's it called when you're a Catholic? What's it called? Yes, that's what he's seeking with a therapist. And then he goes back home, he's sober for a while, then he drinks again, and then he goes to, to confess, so to speak, to the therapist. And so that's his pattern. And that's how he portrays himself. And he portrays himself with with this moral compass. So, but he also in a way signalizes that that he has a sense about other people, and he wants to be a responsible person. And obviously it's a master narrative that the therapist continuously seeks to reinforce. But Niklas is not quite buying in because he really signalizes another one. These are 2 examples from our study. And because I feared that, well, I'm trying, I think you can already hear that. I'm trying to say, that the therapist is pretty active here in actually introducing new stories and ways to interpret, and not, well, yeah, I'll come back to that later. And I thought that there's the risk that you might say, well, these studies from the Danish elderly study, these encounters, it's not good, am I? I would say they are. They have been tested. They have been mighty scored and all kinds of stuff by Terry Moyers, by the way, in collaboration with Lotte Kramer. So this really, but I chose to take another one, try to take another one. So I tried to take a slightly more classical interview as well. Some of you will know that. It's called The Rounder. I don't know why it's called The Rounder. To me, it has always been, just, the truck driver, but it is called the Rounder. I don't know actually what that means, but those of you at least who have been on the early TNTs have definitely used that during your TNT, and I have used it in tons of training. It's a wonderful interview with Terry Moyers and a guy who has been caught in drunk driving. And this guy is driving a truck. I guess he's on his way back from work. He has been drinking. It's not, I mean, probably he's so used to drinking that he has a high tolerance. And there's an elderly lady that bunches into him at a crosslight, I believe it is. But because he's been drinking and has alcohol in his blood, he's the one who gets fined. He's the one who is, where the judge is probably going to say to him, he has to seek treatment. And he is extremely angry when he shows up with Terry Moyers. And this is, I guess, some of the parts, I guess perhaps it's even the start of this interview. And I found a transcript on the internet. I was happy for that because it's a tough job to just write it yourself. So this truck driver says, the court sent me here. And the therapist says, that's the only reason you're here. Well, I'll be honest with you. There's no need in me lying to you because unless you go down and tell the court that that I'm not motivated to be here or anything. But I'll be honest with you. It's taking a lot of time that I don't have. It's taking off money I don't have for the court and the fines and all this stuff. And on top of that, I got to pay my lawyer $1,000, which I don't have, to represent me. And I guess he's probably one of the reasons why I'm here today. But do you know that he and I drink together? I've known this guy ever since he got out of law school. He's a good friend of mine. But I said, no, why do I have to go up there? I'm paying you $1,000 to represent me, and I have to go over and go through this evaluation and all that. That can't make sense. And he says, you got a drinking problem. Hell, I had to take him home a lot of times that I've been the one standing and he's been passed out and couldn't walk. It don't make sense. None of this makes sense. And the therapist, so it's confusing to you why your drinking should cause a problem, or everybody should be talking about it when you look around and you see that other people drink more than that. That's very beautiful. And it continues. And back in the old days, when we talk about rolling with the resistance, there's a lot of rolling with the resistance here, and perhaps now we can talk about it again. But that's really what is going on here. And then I'll take apart from the end of the story, because all throughout this story, there's a lot of listening, there's a lot of mirroring, there's a lot of really trying to, downplay and every now and then a little what we call the paradox reflections, where you step a little bit further and this truck driver diminishes a little bit of his arguments. And then it comes to the end, more or less, where the truck driver says, there was another thing I was thinking about. If I don't stop drinking, I'm probably going to be right back in this mess again. Yeah. Maybe not right away, but somewhere down the road. It sounds like if you look ahead, take a look at your drinking and see where you're going to go with that. You're kind of worried about that. Yeah, because if I don't get out of this, if I can save my house, if I get out of this, if I can save my house and my job, I'd better do something that's going to keep me from doing this again, don't you think? It's time for you to really get serious about this. Yeah, I did something about the fighting. He had been talking about fighting at some point. I just didn't go to the bars no more. Right, you were successful in changing that in the past, and it sounds like you kind of like to be successful changing this. As long as I'm putting all this money into it, I'd like to come out with something. You'd like to get something for your money, huh? That makes sense, don't it? Yeah, it sure does. Oh boy, but boy, I tell you what, I'm sure Bit really looking forward to any of this. I don't know. So you kind of feel two ways about it. On the one hand, you know, you think you would like to have a change and you would like to quit drinking. And on the other hand, you kind of dread it. Is that normal? Yeah, that's real normal for people when they first start thinking about something like this. It's beautiful. It's a really beautiful interview. And if you try to this is what Terry obviously is doing, because this is what we learn to do. I mean, we so to speak introduces a picture of what you are thinking of and your intentions. This is what we do. So again, if you try to look at this encounter through the mirror or the glasses by Michael Bamberg, it is just try to understand what's going on. It is a story about a man who's not feeling trusted, who feels he's being treated unfairly, and he is really forced to take actions, and he don't like it. And this story is throughout the whole encounter negotiated and transformed by the therapist into a story about worry and about considerations of treatment. This is what's going on, face value. On the second level, I mean, it is a client that's forced to meeting a therapist. It's not, I'm not seeking help in that respect. I'm forced to come here. And throughout the reframing that the therapist is offering to the positions of these two, is shifting back and forth from having authority to become far more collaborative. And they're shifting between being the one who's defining the story. And in the end, obviously, they're almost chatting. I mean, then he's really friendly towards her. So there's positioning that's clearly changed. And if you look at the master narratives that are drawing upon, so the first one is really, I would say, from a European perspective. This is an almost classical one. I could transform it into a Western. I mean, this is a lonely, unfairly treated man against the rest of the world. And then it's changed. It changes into becoming a master narrative or drawing upon a master narrative. And this is what the therapist is doing, into a concerned, responsible, brave person considering options for getting his life back on track. So it's definitely not this man with the back up against this wall. And this is not new to us. I guess we've talked about it sometimes. But when you look upon it, at least that was my experience, and this is now where we may disagree. But when I look upon it from these mirrors, glasses is called. It's not mirrors, glasses, of course. When you look upon it through these glasses, it becomes pretty obvious how you negotiate what stories to draw upon. So on all three levels, there's some kind of reframing of this client's position. And you see what we call a protagonist, or the active, subject in these stories, is actually moving from being very passive up against the wall to becoming, of course, an active one. So he's being repositioned throughout these narratives. And it's been done by suggesting he has some specific thoughts that he doesn't necessarily have or had beforehand. Obviously, he will get them, but obviously not necessarily had beforehand. So if you look at what's happening here in these three examples, so you see that through all these small snippets of stories, of pieces of stories, of small stories, incidents, events, there's some kind of overarching narrative that appears. And we can see that how the MI therapists, by asking these open-ended questions, offering information, reflecting and summarizing, and lending, an expression we often use, at least in the Scandinavian TOT, we lend the client words into something that changes, that stimulates change. And we see how the client is repositioned in the narrative. It becomes far more active subject in the narrative. And we talk about, and that's in the new book, and that I completely agree, that now we talk about empowerment here, and we're doing that by means of our languages. But that leads me back to where we opened. And the first part, what drives change? I mean, this is how we tend to think about it. That the more change talk people say, the more, this is something I just invented, but I mean, the higher the likelihood for a positive outcome. And we say when it comes to sustained talk and the relation to outcome, it goes in the other direction. The less sustained talk, the less likelihood for a positive outcome. And we have talked about these therapy skills. The more am I consistent and the less am I, the more likely for a positive outcome. And I was beginning to wonder, if you talk about the person in the narratives that we co-construct, is it also that way? It's not just, I mean, I begin to wonder when we talk about change talk, how important is exactly the activation bit, and to position the client as active, if you understand what I mean. I began to wonder about that. And I also began to, talk about this narrative ownership rights. I mean, whose stories is this when it comes to it? And that's where I quoted from the new book, where it says that MI is not about installing motivation in people, but rather evoking it from them. You do not provide the motivation any more than a midwife provides a baby. You bring it out, calling for what's already there. It's about discovering the person's own motivation. Is that true? That's where I can leave just right after this meeting. Because I really wonder a little bit, at least within these walls, how the question of narrative ownership relates to this large story, master story of MI, that we don't impose motivation on people, that we don't install it in it. We evoke them from them. It's already there. I'm a little bit in doubt. I just need to say that. And by really diving into these encounters, I also began to wonder, how does this relate to training? Because we spend so much time in training, focusing on form, training to reflect, open-ended questions, summaries, and so on. We don't spend, I mean, of course, we spend time on look out for change talk, remember to bring it all into your summaries, try to, recognize sustained talk and soften it if you can. And, so of course we are concerned about content, but we are not so concerned about content. We tend in a way to put it under the headline of change talk and sustained talk. And I think, at least to me, when I was diving into these encounters, it became rather clear to me that there were very different things going on. And perhaps we should address that more in training, at least in advanced trainings. And I got inspired by a guy called James Phelan. And now we are back again to my story about diving into narrative medicine. There's a guy called, a very, very clever guy, James Phelan, who works in narrative medicine and has just written a wonderful book about how literature makes sense for clinicians and how you can become a more engaged clinician by reading classical literature and really trying to understand. And he talks about the principles of reading. And that, to me, it was an aha moment, and unfortunately, it doesn't translate well into Danish. But he talks about, of course, when you read something, when as a reader you are trying to understand what you're reading, and you are reading as a member of, so to speak, the target audience. If this is a book, a novel writing to young people, and you are a young person reading it, then you are trying to understand what this novel is about, and you are trying it as young people. But then you are also trying to overstanding. And that was a wonderful concept I haven't even thought of. And it doesn't make sense in Danish language, but it makes sense in English. Because overstanding is where you're not just trying to dive into the novel and understand it, but it's where you relate it to yourself, your own life, to the context. I mean, if you are reading a novel written by Solzhenitsyn, what does that give me in my life now? How does that fit into a context? What does it say about women and men and their relation? All that other kind of stuff. That's overstanding. And I just love that concept. Understanding, overstanding. I loved it. And James Phelan talks about springboarding between the two. That's what you do. That's where you, so to speak, relates content to the situation. And I think that's what we are actually doing when we are trying to understand a client. You are trying to understand. So that's classical, just like you understand a novel. But all the time, you're also overstanding. You're trying to be a little bit longer down the road. You're trying to see how it fits. How does that fit with the bigger picture? How does it fit with the situation? And you try to pass and you jump back and forth between these two. And I know in a way this is extremely simple, but to me, I must admit, after so many years in Mint, to me it was an aha moment. And although it is in a way simple that this is what we're doing, but I was wondering how much this is something that we perhaps should maybe also discuss in trainings, and perhaps also a dimension that may explain. If you go back now, I'm not sure I can go back. That MI works and it doesn't always work. Maybe that's because there are bits here that we are missing when we are measuring quality of MI and so on by just registered form. I mean, reflections, open-ended questions, and perhaps there are dimensions of change that are more core or more central, and I don't know. Yeah, that was more or less what I was saying. Yeah. And as I said, I haven't talked about this before, so I know we are pretty early. I mean, I didn't know how long it lasted. So, but of course, if there are questions and comments, I would love to have comments in particular, also questions, but comments if there are any. And if not, then I need coffee. I can tell you. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Oh. I'm sorry. I just took for granted that people were running out. Where's the? Sorry, I think you need to have a microphone. I'm sorry about that, but George is running or coming, or can I do something? Sorry? You don't run anymore. You're too young to say that.
Oh, that one?
Both? Participants can
oh, good Lord.
Yes, that's exactly. I mean, you feel.
Technology.
Put that on there.
Yeah. Now I need to walk to my seat.
I don't know.
All right. So here, more than a question, I have a comment. More than a comment, perhaps. I want to thank you for bringing literature into the big picture. Mouth like that, like if I were drinking,
exactly.
I can do that.
Exactly. Yeah,
all right, yeah. I am so good at this. Beer drinker here. So I wanted to thank you for doing so, because I have been actually this morning talking with some new Minty about MI and all the pieces of MI and how language already incorporates all of them, and rhetoric also provides so many things. And what I appreciate of MI is that through the evidence-based studies, we are able to identify it clearly. You do this, but still remains a format. But there is so much about language and so much about stories. And within the big stories is where the richness of the human experience lies. And of course, literature. I have a same background in literature. And I went the opposite way. I did literature and then I become a psychotherapist to be able to understand my characters, my literary characters, who really are very rich, and they are based on human experiences. So we go back and forth in those stories. And what you have brought up, I think, is going to enrich the experience of MI.
I completely agree. That's all the literature, all the big stories. That's what both unite us, and we draw on when we explain, and that we really need to be far more aware of that. I completely agree. Thank you so much. That was really lovely.
Thank you so much. You've given me a gift. I've been around motivational interviewing since the 90s, doing the best I can with it. I was only minted in 2020. But your presentation, which was wonderful, left me feeling more validated as a clinician than I ever have before, because I've been instilling better narratives in patients' stories, I hope, but now I don't have to feel guilty about it.
No. No, exactly. No. Thank you. That's exactly.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
I have a gift in return. I know what a rounder is.
What is it?
Terry explained it to me. She and I have been friends for 20 years or more. But a rounder is someone who would go to bars and fight for money.
Okay.
And apparently the interviewee in that.
Yeah, he did that when he was young. Yes. That's
and he was actually a staff member or a colleague at that time, but he role played something that made sense to him.
Wow.
And so that was, I guess, sort of a real play, but as you've pointed out, very effective. Thank you.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you for that. I've been wondering so many times. I feel I need to come with a comment. I am exactly like you. I don't blame MI for installing narratives. Not at all. I think actually it's an asset. I think it's a strong thing. I think it's a beautiful way of doing it. So in a way, I do think it's a purpose. So it's not like saying that we should not affect the stories. Of course, we should affect the stories of the patients and the narratives, all that. I completely mean that. And I don't think that is manipulation or anything. I think that's actually what it should be. This is where people are getting help because they can attach to other stories and we're helping them with it. So just to make sure, I'm not, I'm not. What? Oh, sorry.
Thank you for this interesting presentation. Some of my thoughts were that this is really interesting kind of qualitative science that provides a rich description and some interconnections of various levels of analysis. What it perhaps lacks in the steps of also how to conduct training inspired by this are the things usually emphasized in psychological science, or at least the Skinnerian tradition, namely prediction and control. You don't have exact variables to manipulate. But in a way, it's not a bad thing, but they're also easy to add if you take. There's a lot of stuff in cognitive science about psychological distance. So when the Phelan speaks about understanding versus overstanding, this could be construed as lesser or greater inner distance of the phenomena observed. Whether the patient is more enmeshed and identified with his narrative or is able to observe it from further afar. So that's the...
that's good, but I don't, thank you for coming with that input. I don't have any answers to this. I just realized when we were looking at these encounters that when we do training, we focus more about the form and less about the content. And I was just, so I'm throwing this out as a question, and it may be we all agree that no, we should not pay attention to that in training, or it may be that we should. So I'm just, yes, Christina?
I have some questions from quite a few people, so I will get round to. I make my way across, but just so you know, I will get to you.
Yes, I won't.
Thank you.
Thank you. This is wonderful. And so I'm not sure, I don't know, I'm not sure how many people are familiar with acceptance and commitment therapy. I know, Stan, you're here. But there's a lot of overlap that I think you'd really appreciate, because we talk a lot about storytelling, and there's a lot of emphasis on process and language and values. And so this feels like it fits a lot. The other piece is perspective taking, so that we try and get patients to take perspective outside of themselves, and we also help them see that. And so this feels like so aligned, and it also feels incredibly validating. And I think it's very consistent with MI4 of really how Bill and Steve, I don't want to talk for you, but really just how looking at MI in the world, not just as specific, but how does it relate to other interventions and other processes? And so thank you for bringing that perspective here. And I appreciated that perspective of the rounder, who we've all seen for like 20 plus years. And it's just so nice to see it in that different perspective. So just wanted to share that if you're not familiar with acceptance and commitment therapy, it's just such a wonderful complement to the work we do.
And to me, it's really a great comfort that most of these traditions actually do fit together. There's so much overlap, and then there are bits and pieces, you know, that are special to. But there's a core that's rare, and I think that's. I mean, that makes you happy in a way, because that makes there's not a competition at all. Yes.
So we do have time for more questions. Could anyone who has a question or comment please raise their hand? Okay, that is great. I will go over to here because I know some people raise their hands first, and I'll work my way back this section. If anyone else does, please let me know. It's just so I can do this in the most effective way for all of you. So over here, if you could raise your hands again. 1, 2, perfect. Start here then.
So appreciate your talk. It was really amazing. Thank you for that. I've been thinking a lot about, and actually what it made me think about was when you read a good book or a good poem or even a song and you see yourself in it, like the overstanding piece. I wonder how much that is what we're doing. Because I've been reflecting on the last, the TNT few days, is how powerful metaphors are. You know, we were talking in the TNT about just a very small, like 10-second comment about sustained talk being like a toddler. You need to give it attention so that it can settle down and be quiet. Otherwise it gets louder. And then that stuck, like just the 10 seconds of that learning stuck as like a metaphor. So I'm just reflecting on, I think some of the skills we use too are what good writers use, is how do you bring forward a story so someone can see themselves in it? And metaphors in particular, I think, is one of the skills that we use to help people design a story differently than they have thought before. And then they see themselves like, oh yes, that makes sense. That metaphor is me. That describes my story.
That's a really good point, Colleen. Thank you. That's a really good point.
So, Anette, hello.
Hi, Joel.
Thank you for a very stimulating and entertaining presentation. Now, one of the things that just stood out, thanks, Dan. One of the things that just stood out to me was what you said. Maybe instead of installing a narrative, what's happening is the narrative is getting evoked, and through the interaction, a coherent story emerges that fits for the client. And part of that for some people could be exploring and resolving the ambivalence that keeps the story from making sense.
I think, yeah, exactly. And I think my point is that it's a co-construction between two people. And I think that's, well, yes.
I do have some comments from the online, so I'll read those out and then I'll come to this center main bit. I haven't forgotten you. I am paying attention. So I'll just read out some of the online comments. We've had 2. One is from Denise Ernst, who I believe is here, but in the room upstairs.
Hi, Colleen. Hi, Denise.
She says, "This is wonderfully thought-provoking. Thank you. It seems that there is a way that the client and therapist co-create the narrative." I can hear myself on my phone. It's distracting me. I'm so sorry. And that is different than installing the story. And in the end, the story belongs to the client, and somehow they will own it. David Rosengren has some very interesting stuff in his book about co-creation.
Lovely.
And then the final comment was from Kathleen Northrup Schneider. And she says, "Annette, I'm so happy to hear about your research and thoughts on story. This is often how I've taught MI, listening to the story of the client. You've clarified the underlying elements in my intuitive approach. Thank you.
Thank you.
So I'm on my way. But we'll start over here and then we'll get over here. I'm on my way. Thank you.
Thank you, Anette, for this wonderful talk. And thank you for providing me with a way to explain to people why MI is not manipulative. Because I often meet people outside of this room, and I don't know if it's a Danish thing or if people meet it all over the world, that some of these examples, I think people who are not as enthusiastic as we are about MI, they might say, oh, this is manipulative. That's not what the patient said. And now I can say, you're right. I'm just providing an example of a story, another way of telling the story. And if the patient doesn't buy it, he or she will say so. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Lotte. That's a good point. Yes, that's a good point. Yes.
Yeah, I can you hear me? Yeah. I just want to add, and I think I'm continuing with what other people said as well, that in narrative therapy, which takes quite a lot from this as well, as they talk about the dominant story, but a lot of other stories that are hidden. And I don't see it as installing someone's stories, but really more eliciting strength stories that people may be avoided in their own life.
Quite close to the chin.
Yeah, I finished.
Okay. Hands, perfect. Keep it close to your chin.
So I was just wondering about the connection of the strength of mental representations, because we know that not everybody can have the same strength of a visual representation, or if they're thinking of something, they have the ability to see it in their mind or hear it. And the people who have stronger mental representations might be easier to realize or come with you on this journey of this new narrative. And the people who have the less ability to visualize or think about the representations in their mind might be harder. It's just a thought I had.
Oh, that's a good thought. I wouldn't know. I think you can picture both. If you don't have, I mean, if you don't have a stronger sense or ability, then maybe you're more prone to accept stories from others. It may be just the opposite. I wouldn't know. You need to think about that, perhaps analyze what's going on in stories. It's a good thought. It's a very interesting thought. Yes.
You rocked it, Anette. Thank you.
Sorry?
You rocked it. You were fabulous.
So I'm not going to get kicked out?
No. Bill was here nodding. I just want you to know you're okay. You can have coffee. So actually this fits very consistently with some things I've been thinking about for a while. And I really think autonomy becomes even more important in all of this stuff as you're articulating, but it's also, no, it's just whispering in Bill's ear. This is why I was saying it should be envisionment or envisioning as opposed to empowerment, because I think there is a co-creation that happens here, and sometimes it's showing folks and then they're deciding, and like we were talking about, whether or not this fits for them. So
that makes a lot of sense. Thank you, David.
Thank you, Anette. Wonderful. Just two things coming to my mind, or many things, but it's one thing was about redirecting attention. As therapists or MI practitioners, we help the person to redirect attention to what is more motivating than what is less motivating. And then I'm not thinking about narratives, but I'm thinking about what I was learned when I learned MI the first years from my colleague Tom Bart. It was describing MI as a building motivation. It's a way of building motivation together with the person. So the co-constructing, the building elements, and you're talking about building narratives, and we are building motivation together with the person. And we are active in suggesting pieces, planting seeds, and also reframe and redirect attention. So thank you for a fabulous
thank you for bringing this forward, because we have talked about this a bit, and you have said that before, and it was so inspiring to me. And it was in my notes that I should say Christina has this thought.
Oh, you didn't
Thank you, Christina. This is really
it wasn't because of me, but I read an article about painting, and a Dutch painter, I can't Vermeer, where someone analyzed the magic in his paintings, and it was about redirecting attention. And I thought, exactly, that's what we're doing in MI. So redirecting and building motivation.
Thank you, Christina. Thank you.
We have time for one more question, so maybe two if you get lucky.
Thank you so much. And how nervous and bold I feel to follow these two comments, but it really pulls on the visual arts, because you're speaking so beautifully to literary arts as expression. And when I train, I talk a lot about engaging as being a witness to a person painting the picture of their life story, and that we're listening, and as they paint it, we might see the dark parts, and as we start to focus with them, it might be inviting them to see the light. And perhaps the co-creation is we take a paintbrush with them by evoking and adding more light.
It's a beautiful point. Thank you.
This will be the final question, I believe, because of the time.
Thank you, Annette. You made me feel proud of the 1997 generation.
A great team. Yes. Us from Malta. Yes.
And you talked about training. Just sharing thoughts, because when we deliver training, we provide guidance in saying, try to promote change talk, to soften, sustain talk, and almost this is it. And now you are suggesting, and I think it's a great suggestion, that we need to tell the trainees, try to help clients reframe their stories, which is probably a step forward. And in this line, I think that you also are providing, one of the things you said, it's they have to be active, not passive. But probably there are some more things, and those other things need to be identified and provided to the trainees, so that we provide guidance to the trainees in this way of helping or co-creating the stories with the patients.
I'm not quite sure what I am proposing. I'm just wondering if we should focus a little bit on, because I think I realized that we talk very often about the differences in change talk, and of course we classify as we have the darn cats and so on. But I guess that I just felt that you could rewrite these transcripts and have the therapist focus on other elements of change talk, and it wouldn't be the same kind of story. So I just really, I guess I pictured that there are some elements that's more about activation and more about, bringing the clients are often up against, the back of the wall, and are passive subjects, perhaps not even subjects in their own stories. They are objects, perhaps even. And maybe that is just, I guess it's a part of change talk, but it's this also being able to perform, overstanding, where you see how you can help the patients to connect to a story where he is empowered. And of course that's empowerment, it is, but it's also about not feeling empowered. It's also about being an active decision-making subject in your own story. And it's not really, of course, there's a lot similarities to narrative therapy. I'm not at all suggesting that we talk about narrative, this becomes narrative therapy. That's not what I talk about. I just had this feeling that there's just more to change talk, that it's just not just one box where everything is just have the same, so to speak, motivating value or whatever you can call it. But there are differences in the content here. So, but still, this is I'm thinking about it. If somebody wants to think about it too, that would be lovely. And we can have discussions about this next time we see. So thank you so much for listening.